There is a particular kind of loneliness that no one ever talks about. It is not the loneliness of an empty room or the ache of being far from home. It is the loneliness of standing in a crowd of people who love you a circumflex euros and still feeling like a stranger. It is the quiet, persistent feeling that the person they see when they look at you is not really you at all. This is the story of a man named Elias, and it begins, as many painful things do, not with a single dramatic moment, but with years of slow, invisible erosion. Elias grew up in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's name, everyone else's business, and everyone else's expectations. His father was a carpenter, a man of few words but immense dignity a circumflex euros, a man whose hands could build something beautiful out of rough, resistant wood. His mother was a schoolteacher who believed, with the kind of faith that can move mountains, that her son was meant for something great. Something great in their town had a very specific shape. It looked like a suit, a desk, a title, a salary that could be spoken aloud at the dinner table without lowering one's voice. Elias was 12 years old the first time he painted something that made him cry. Not because it was sad, because it was true. He had taken an old piece of cardboard from behind his father's workshop and covered it with colors he had mixed from leftover house paint a circumflex euros, blues and burnt oranges, and a strange, deep green that looked like the inside of a forest at dusk. He had sat back and looked at it and felt, for the first time he could name, that something inside him had escaped into the visible world, that the thing churning quietly behind his ribs had found a form, that he was, for a moment, legible to himself in a way he could not yet put into words. His mother had walked in, looked at it for a long moment, and said, "That's lovely, sweetheart. Now come and finish your mathematics." He finished his mathematics. He always did. And the painting stayed in the garage for a week before quietly disappearing. He never asked where it went. Some part of him, the part that had already started to learn, understood that asking would mean admitting the painting had mattered. And mattering a circumflex euros, really mattering, in the tender and private way a circumflex euros, was already beginning to feel like a thing you were supposed to keep to yourself. By the time Elias was 17, he had learned something that no school teaches but life teaches relentlessly. He had learned to perform. He could walk into a room and be whoever that room needed him to be. Around his father, he was serious and responsible. Around his mother, he was studious and grateful. Around his teachers, he was focused and ambitious. Around his friends, he was funny and easy and light. He shifted like water a circumflex euros, finding the shape of every container, never spilling, never overflowing, never making a mess. What he did not realize, not yet, was that water without a shape of its own eventually forgets what it is. He went to university and studied business because business was practical, and practicality was what people who loved him kept handing him like a gift. He told himself, in the way that young people tell themselves things they need to believe, that he liked it well enough, that a person could have two selves a circumflex euros, the one who went to the office and the one who, somewhere in a theoretical future, would have time for everything else. He put all the other things on a shelf inside himself and told himself they would keep. He graduated with honors. He got a job at a firm in the city. He wore the suit. He sat at the desk. He earned the salary. And every evening after the office emptied and he was alone in the fluorescent quiet of a conference room or a bathroom stall or the long elevator ride down to the parking garage, he felt a hollow opening in the center of his chest, like a door left ajar in a house where no one lived. He would stand there in the silence after the day had finished, and he would think, "I did everything right today." And then he would wait for a feeling of satisfaction that never quite arrived. He told no one, because there was no language for it a circumflex euros, or rather there was, but it felt indulgent, almost shameful to use it. What could he possibly say? I have everything I was supposed to want and it feels like wearing someone else's skin. People would have told him he was ungrateful, and perhaps part of him believed they would have been right. He had a good job and a clean apartment and a family that loved him. Grief was supposed to have a reason. Emptiness was supposed to have a cause. This had neither, which made it feel somehow even less permissible to name. So he kept performing. He performed at work and he performed at family dinners, and when he got married at 31 to a woman named Dina who was warm and kind and who loved the version of Elias she had met a circumflex euros. The composed, certain, quietly successful version a circumflex euros. He performed there too, not because he didn't love her. He did, deeply. But loving someone while hiding yourself from them is its own particular form of loneliness. It is loving someone from behind a glass wall. You can see each other. You can even touch in a way, but the cold pain is always there. Dina noticed. She was perceptive, the way some people are perceptive not because they are brilliant but because they care enough to pay attention. She would watch him sometimes a circumflex euros at parties, at dinners with colleagues a circumflex euros, and see the way he smiled at exactly the right moment, said exactly the right thing, tilted his head at exactly the right angle, and she would feel something she couldn't name. It wasn't suspicion. It wasn't fear. It was more like the feeling of reaching for someone in a dark room and finding that your hands pass through them, as though the person you were touching wasn't entirely solid. One evening, when their daughter Mara was about 4 years old and already asleep, Dina found Elias sitting on the kitchen floor with Mara's crayons spread around him. He had drawn something on the back of an envelope a circumflex euros, a face, or the suggestion of a face, with one side bright and the other side fading into nothing. He didn't hear her come in. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him. His shoulders were different, looser. The careful architecture of his posture had dissolved, and he was just sitting there, cross-legged on the tile, drawing on an envelope with a 4-year-old's crayons, and he looked a circumflex euros. This was the word that came to her a circumflex euros real. Elias, she said softly. He startled, and immediately she watched the performance reassemble itself. His spine straightened. His hands moved to collect the crayons as though tidying up evidence. He looked up at her with that measured smile and said, "Sorry, couldn't sleep." "Don't," she said. He looked at her. "Don't put it away," she said. "Whatever that was, don't put it away." He didn't speak for a long time. And then, in a voice she had never heard from him before a circumflex euros, rough and unpolished, like something that had been buried a circumflex euros, he said, "I don't know who I am when nobody needs me to be anything." It was, perhaps, the most honest thing he had said to another human being in 20 years. What followed was not a dramatic turning point. Life rarely works that way. There was no single morning where Elias woke up transformed, but something had cracked open, and even a small crack lets light in. He started painting again, not on cardboard this time. He bought a small canvas and some real paint a circumflex euros. He stood in the art supply store for almost 20 minutes, overwhelmed by the colors, by the feeling of being somewhere he had no practice self for a circumflex euros, and he set it up in the corner of the garage on a Saturday afternoon. He stood in front of it for 45 minutes without touching a brush, just breathing. There was something almost frightening about the blankness of it. A blank canvas, he realized, has no performance to give. It asks only for something real. Mara wandered in at some point and sat on a stool nearby, and watched him with the uncomplicated patience of a child who has nowhere more important to be. "Why aren't you painting?" she asked. "I'm trying to remember how," he said. "You just do it," she said, with all the authority of a 4-year-old who has never once doubted herself. He picked up the brush. What came out was not beautiful, at least not in any conventional sense. It was messy and uncertain and too dark in places and too thin in others. But it was his. He could feel, in a way he had forgotten was possible, that each brushstroke was coming from somewhere real inside him, not from a script, not from an audience's expectation, not from a version of himself assembled for other people's comfort. He painted for 2 hours, and when he stopped his hands were shaking slightly, and his chest felt strange a circumflex euros. tight and open at the same time, the way your lungs feel after you've been crying or after a long run. He showed Dina that evening. She looked at it for a long time. "It's you," she said finally. "It's a mess," he said. "I know," she said, and she was smiling. "It's you." The months that followed were not easy. There is nothing easy about dismantling a performance you have been giving for 3 decades. Elias started therapy, not because he had a crisis, but because Dina asked him to, gently, the way she asked for most things a circumflex euros, with kindness and without ultimatum. He sat across from a therapist named Dr. Sarah, who had the particular gift of asking simple questions that contained enormous weight. In the first session, he was polished, composed. He told the story of his life in a way that made sense, with a beginning and a logic and a reasonable explanation for every feeling. Dr. Sarah listened, and when he finished, she said, "That's a very well-organized story." He had accepted it as a compliment before he noticed the way she said it, not with admiration, with curiosity. "When was the first time you felt like you had to hide something about yourself?" she asked, in their third session. He thought about the cardboard painting, about his mother's lovely sweetheart, about the mathematics. "I was 12, he said. "And what did you decide at 12? That it meant a circumflex euros, that the things you loved had to be set aside?" He had to think about that for a long time. "I decided it meant I was doing love wrong," he said slowly. "Like the way I loved things a circumflex euros, art, making things, just being alone with my own thoughts a circumflex euros, was somehow selfish. Like real love meant giving people what they needed from you, not what you needed for yourself." Dr. Sarah nodded. "And how has that belief served you?" He looked out the window. A pigeon was walking along a ledge with great deliberate seriousness as though it had somewhere important to be. "It kept people comfortable," he said. "It kept the peace. It made me easy to love." He paused. "But I think it made me very hard to know." That sentence stayed with him for weeks. "It made me very hard to know." He turned it over in his mind like a stone in his palm. He thought about all the people who loved him a circumflex euros, his parents, his wife, his friends a circumflex euros, and he realized with a grief that surprised him that most of them, if pressed, could not have told you what he was actually like. They could tell you what he was like to be around. They could tell you he was dependable and steady and kind and good in a crisis. But they could not have told you what he dreamed about at night, what music made the back of his throat ache, what he believed about the world when he was quiet and alone and no one was watching. He had been so busy maintaining his shadow a circumflex euros, the shape he cast for others a circumflex euros, that he had forgotten what was making it. His mother came to visit that autumn when the leaves were turning and the air smelled like wood smoke and the particular melancholy of seasons ending. Elias had put one of his paintings in the living room a circumflex euros, a small one, nothing grand, just a study in color, the kind of thing he had been doing in the garage on quiet weekend mornings. His mother saw it and stopped. "Who painted that?" she asked. "I did," he said. She looked at him, then back at the painting. Something moved across her face a circumflex euros, a sequence of emotions too quick and layered to name individually, but the sum of them looked like recognition. "You used to paint," she said, "when you were small." "Yes. I didn't know you still did." "I stopped for a long time," he said. "I'm starting again." She sat down in the armchair by the window. She looked tired in the way that people look tired not from lack of sleep, but from carrying something heavy for years without setting it down. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "if I made you feel like it wasn't important." He sat across from her. "You didn't do it to hurt me," he said. "You did it because you were afraid, because you wanted me to be safe and secure, and for you those things had a specific shape." "I should have asked what shape they had for you," she said. It was the closest either of them had ever come to the core of the thing, and somehow, in the tenderness of that admission, something between them eased. Not healed, exactly a circumflex euros. These things rarely heal cleanly a circumflex euros, but eased, like a knot given a little slack. Elias thought about his father who had built furniture in small rooms and once, memorably, a treehouse in the backyard that had lasted 15 years. His father who had never once told Elias to paint or not to paint, to be one thing or another a circumflex euros, who had simply, quietly, done his work, who had found his worth in the grain of the wood and the precision of the joint and the satisfaction of making something real with his hands. His father had never explained himself to anyone. He had not constructed an image for public consumption. He had been, from Elias' earliest memory, exactly and only himself a circumflex euros, and the people around him had loved him for it, not in spite of it. His father had lived inside his own shape all along, and Elias had somehow never thought to look at that and understand it as permission. He had watched his father his whole life and concluded, somehow, that the lesson was practicality. It had never occurred to him that the real lesson was integrity. The integrity of being one whole thing, in every room, under every light. He called his father that night. His father answered after 2 rings, the way he always did. "I've been painting," Elias said without preamble. A short silence. "The walls?" his father asked. Elias laughed a circumflex euros, really laughed, not the practiced, careful laugh he deployed at parties. "No, Dad, on canvas." Another short silence. Then, in the same unhurried voice his father used for everything, as though nothing in the world required urgency. "That's good, son. That sounds like a good thing." It was not a grand declaration. It was 4 words and a sentence. But from his father, who had always spoken in the currency of understatement, it landed like a benediction. Elias did not quit his job. This is not that kind of story. He did not move to a countryside cottage and live on art and vegetables and romanticized simplicity. He kept going to the office. He kept wearing the suit. But something inside the suit was different now. Something inside it was actually him. He started being more honest at work a circumflex euros, not recklessly, not in ways that burned bridges, but in the small daily ways that matter. When he disagreed with a decision, he said so calmly with evidence. When he didn't know something, he said that too, instead of performing confidence he didn't have. When a younger colleague came to him with an idea that was unconventional and uncertain, Elias didn't redirect her toward the safe, expected path. He listened. He asked questions. He helped her believe the uncertain thing was worth pursuing. She came to him afterward and said, "You're different than I expected you to be." "Different how?" he asked. She thought about it. "Less like a role," she said, "more like a person." He understood exactly what she meant, and he felt the truth of it in the place in his chest that had been hollow for so long. Mara was 6 when she asked him, out of nowhere in the car on the way to school, "Daddy, what's your favorite thing in the world?" He didn't hesitate. "Painting," he said, "and you and your mom and coffee in some order." She thought about this with great seriousness. "Can painting be first?" she asked. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Why?" "Because it's yours," she said. "I'm still figuring out my thing. I want you to have your thing." He was 38 years old, and his 6-year-old daughter had just given him something it had taken him decades to give himself. The right to have his own thing. The right to be the origin of his own shadow, not just its shape. There is a thought that stayed with Elias long after these events, long after the painting became a quiet but steady part of his life, long after he and Dina had found a new honesty in their marriage that was more difficult and also so much more real than what had come before. The thought was this: a shadow only matches its owner when the owner is standing up straight, in full light, with nothing hidden. For years, his shadow had not matched him. It had been larger in some places a circumflex euros, performing competence, performing certainty, performing ease a circumflex euros, and absent in others, all the soft and uncertain and hungry and creative parts of him pressed down below the surface, invisible, casting nothing. He had been moving through the world as a carefully maintained shape, and the shape had been convincing enough that almost no one questioned it. But a shape without a self inside it is just an outline. And outlines, no matter how precise, cannot be loved the way that real things can be loved. The work of becoming legible to yourself is slow and uncomfortable. It requires you to sit with the parts of you that feel inconvenient, or strange, or out of place in the life you have constructed. It requires you to disappoint, in small ways, the expectations of people you love a circumflex euros. Not to be cruel, not to be careless, but because the alternative is to disappear from yourself entirely, and a person who has disappeared from themselves has very little left to give anyone else. Elias learned this. He kept learning it. He was still learning it. But there came a morning a circumflex euros, a particular unremarkable Tuesday morning a circumflex euros, when he was standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee, watching the light come in at its early morning angle, and he caught his reflection in the glass. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, the person looking back at him did not feel like a stranger. The posture was the same. The face was the same. But behind the eyes was something present, something located, something that had stopped apologizing for being there. His shadow that morning matched. Not perfectly, not forever, but in that moment, in the ordinary grace of an ordinary Tuesday, it matched. And that, he understood, was enough to keep going. That was enough to keep doing the quiet, unglamorous, necessary work of being yourself in a world that is always, gently or forcefully, suggesting you be someone else. There is something I want to leave with you today, if you'll let me. We spend so much of our lives worried about the impression we make a circumflex euros, the version of ourselves that reaches other people, the shadow we cast on the world around us. We refine it and adjust it and hold it carefully like something that might break. But the shadow is not the point. The shadow is only evidence. And if the shadow doesn't match what's actually standing there, no amount of careful management will make it feel like home. You don't have to burn your life down to be honest about who you are. You don't have to become unrecognizable to the people who love you. But you do have to be willing to let yourself be known a circumflex euros. A little more each day, in the small places, in the quiet moments, in the things you allow yourself to love without justification. The world doesn't need a more perfect version of who you think you should be. It needs the version that actually exists a circumflex euros, uncertain and particular and specific to you. That version is the only one who can cast your shadow, and when your shadow finally matches, you'll know it. Not because anyone tells you, but because for the first time in perhaps a very long time, you'll look at your own reflection and feel, simply and without drama, like you've come home. If this story touched something in you a circumflex euros, if it reminded you of someone you used to be, or someone you're still becoming a circumflex euros, please share it with someone who might need to hear it today. A like means more than you know. It helps this little channel reach the people who are quietly waiting for a story like this one. And if you're new here, we'd love to have you stay. Subscribe to Taylor's Laundry and come back whenever you need a story that feels like a conversation with your own heart. Thank you for being here, truly.